Today. Okay, very cool. So yes, I am the Executive Director of Humanities Montana, a proud Executive Director, and we have in the room a board member from Butte, Connie Doherty. Please join me in thanking Connie for serving on our board. And, whoops, I guess I better go back. There we go.
There we go.
So we are celebrating our 45th year of service to Montana. So if you don't know Humanities Montana, we are an independent nonprofit. We provide programs and grants on history, literature, Native American studies, contemporary events, all over the state of Montana. And so Neil Lewing, who is extraordinary, I hope you saw Neil a couple weeks ago. Neil is an example of the Montana Conversation programs we deliver all over the state. And our priority, by the way, is to get out of the university communities. We certainly do fund grants and programs in Missoula and Bozeman, but we recognize that as university towns, they have a lot of opportunities. So we want to serve Butte and a lot of other communities. So anyway, I'm so happy you're here to share. I do have to give a brief advertisement. I am going to touch on Butte a little bit today in my talk, but tonight at the Chateau at 7 p.m., I'll be reading from my new book, Montana 1889. I'll be reading from the book. I'm going to read 3 excerpts that really do focus on Butte. So if you want a little bit more Butte from 1889, please join me. So my talk today is based on these 2 books, and I'll just be upfront about it. I wrote the books in order to both satisfy my own curiosity and perhaps to help Montanans think about their past and their present, and yes, to raise funds for my organization. So if you were to buy a book today, the cost for each book, either 1864 or 1889, the cost is $20 per book, of which 10 will go directly to Humanities Montana. And I just gave a talk in Dillon 2 weeks ago. It was a wonderful time, but somebody in the crowd was bold enough to raise their hand and say, so, are you independently wealthy or something? No, I'm not. Okay, just be on the record here. No, but we do see this as a way to raise funds to make sure we do get the programs and grants all over the state of Montana. So anyway, happy to sign, happy to chat, would love to visit with you. So today what I thought would be interesting is to give you a kind of before and after account of Montana. So Montana 1864 obviously tells the year of Montana's territorial creation, right? And then 1889 will forward us 25 years to the year of statehood. And it's just intriguing to compare and contrast. What was the place like in 64 versus 89? So what I've done is I've selected specific individuals whose lives embody those changes. In other words, we're going to track them from 64 to 89 to see how change happens in the actual lived experience of Montanans. Okay, so that's what we're going to do. To begin to do that, I thought I would just share with you some basics about what Montana was like in 1864. And of course, you know, the territory was created by the signature of Abraham Lincoln on May 26, 1864. Boom, out of nothing, suddenly we have a territory called Montana. And I often laugh about this because I bet you share this with me. I love Montana. I travel the world and I say, I love Montana. And it kind of dawns on you at a certain point, this is totally made up, this place called Montana. Even the name is controversial, although I won't go into depth on that today. You can see the change in population that occurred. So because of primarily the gold mining that's occurring in Bannock, Virginia City, Helena, even here in Old Butte, right? So because of that gold mining, you're having this influx of immigrants from places north, south, east, west, along various trails. That means the white population goes from fewer than 1,000 white immigrants in 1861 to 20,000 by 1865. What a dramatic surge, right? And that is, we think, about on a par with the number of indigenous peoples who were either occupying or moving through the territory in about that time period. We have, of course, the creation of major communities that are very much at the heart of Montana today. We have Bozeman, we have Butte, we have Helena, and we have Missoula. And the book 1864 tells about the creation of all of those communities. And then I like to just slip in this detail because we can never forget that Montana was born in the midst of Civil War. And in fact, that's really why it was created, right? Abraham Lincoln and other Republicans, and by the way, the terms Republican and Democrat have very different meanings in 1864 than they do today, and you'll probably pick up a little bit of that as I go through my talk. But anyway, so the Republicans who are leading the Union in 1864 are eager to secure this place for the Union or Republican cause. So that's a major reason that the territory is created. Anyway, on the 4th of July in 1864, in Fort Benton, that rough, tough, very, very important river town, we have an account from a guy named William Gladstone, who's the great-grandfather of Jack Gladstone. If you know Jack, he's a great singer, songwriter. Anyway, William Gladstone reports that the streets of Fort Benton were hell on earth. Hell on earth. And you can speculate why. There are literally street battles going on in Fort Benton because everybody's liquored up. It's the day to celebrate the birth of the United States. If you have Confederate leanings, you don't believe in that cause, right? And so apparently a very nasty moment on the streets of Fort Benton. So let's fast forward now. Let's get some data from 1889. You probably know the state was born officially on November 8, 1889. Population, look at that. In 25 years, we've gone from approximately 20,000 immigrants and 20,000 indigenous people all the way up to 142,000. By the way, 25 years was considered a very long time to wait for statehood, but the reality is because this territory was so Democratic leaning, the Republican leaders in the House, Senate, and White House did not want to bring this place into full statehood. So very interesting detail. Founding of various communities, and it's so interesting to me. I was a kid, I was born in Polson, grew up in Montana, and I've always been curious about when were these towns created? Where did they come from? Well, you discover when you do this kind of research that towns like Great Falls, Billings, Glasgow, Red Lodge, they are creations of the mining industry and creations of the railroads. And that means that they're born essentially in the 1870s through the 1880s. And so that's just, so you compare and contrast the ages and the origins of these communities. And then it's absolutely critical. We just acknowledged that by 1889, we have a series of reservations that have been created. There's no nice way to put it. Those reservations are created in order to confine indigenous peoples so that the land would be accessible for mining, for cattle running, for sheep running, for the railroads themselves, for other forms of economic development like timber. And so, specifically in 1888, there's the Sweetgrass Treaty that takes the Blackfeet Reserve. Actually, I'll advance to the map here. So, in 1888, the Sweetgrass Treaty takes this vast Blackfeet Reserve that goes all the way across what is now the state of Montana, all the land above, I don't know if this works or not really, but the land above the Missouri River all the way to the Canadian border, that was the Blackfeet Reserve. That is now carved up and it is parceled out in these much smaller reservations which we have today, right? Fort Peck, Fort Belknap, and Blackfeet. Just a point of information, Rocky Boy up on the High Line is not created until 1916, and I'm actually going to read about that a little bit tonight at the Chateau if you're curious. So that's some background. So this is what Montana looks like in 1889. A lot of my storytelling in 1889, of course, is out east because that's where the changes are occurring. But to begin to tell the story of Montana 1864 versus 1889, I'm actually going to begin with an incredibly charismatic leader of the Lakota people. And you might look at this photo. By the way, isn't that an incredible photo? I hope you can see it. It's just, is the light good? Should we turn the lights off? It's okay?
Yeah.
Okay, good. It's an extraordinary photo. This was taken at Pine Ridge about a year after Wounded Knee. So this is a place with a lot of, is that better?
Yeah.
So this is a place with a lot of resonance and significance. This is a young man afraid of his horses, and he's an extremely important leader. Now, to appreciate what I'm about to share, think about what he was doing in 1864. In 1864, he participates in a major battle at what is now Pryor, near Pryor in Montana, just south of Billings. And he is on the side of the Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho, who are essentially assaulting the Apsalico or Crow people. This is in August of 1864. Young Man Afraid of His Horses is a key ally of a particularly famous Lakota warrior, Crazy Horse. So why are they there? They're there in 1864 because they're being forced west by the influx of all these immigrants and some military that's moving into the Dakotas. So they are migrating west, they're fighting with the Crow in order to control bison hunting grounds, and that's the story of 1864. Fast forward to 1889, and we have an extraordinary letter from Young Man Afraid of His Horses. This was written in January of 1889, and listen to the difference between that man of 64 and that man of 89. He's writing to General Crook, asking for permission to go from his Pine Ridge Reservation to the Crow Reservation. The letter reads, "I want to visit the Crows and plan with them for the protection of our people, for the white man is crowding us and will want to crowd us still more. Having become as one nation related to each other, the former enemies will talk of things that are of interest and what is best for our common welfare." He pleads his case by pointing out that I have relatives among the Crows by the marriage of my aunt. They gave me 3 horses, and I want to get them. So why am I beginning with this story? In part because it shows the dramatic change of 25 years, but more than that, it shows us a key tactic among indigenous peoples responding to changes occurring in those 25 years, responding to the imposition of reservation boundaries, responding to the destruction of the bison herds. They are sharing information across tribal and reservation boundaries. And in fact, there's a kind of an almost comic moment. We have one agent, Indian agent, writing in 1889. This is up at Fort Peck. He says, "I'm tired of these Indians leaving the reservation to go talk to other Indians because of their freaks. They're leaving the reservation for freaks," which is his way of saying that they're leaving for his view unvalid, non-valid reasons. Anyway, this is Young Man Afraid of His Horses. And the other point I want to emphasize is that I don't want us to imagine that indigenous peoples kind of sunk into a hopelessness, a deep despair. Of course there was that, I'm going to share that in a moment, but there was also an attempt to respond to adjust to these profound changes in the land. And that brings us to a great Crow leader. You probably know about Plentyhead, a great Apsalica or Crow leader. He also was at the Battle of Arrow Creek in 1864. He's on the opposite side from Young Man Afraid of His Horses. And in many ways, he will declare that the Battle of Arrow Creek was a victory for his people, for the Crow people. Fast forward to 1889, and for Plentyhead, he's recognizing the vast changes that have occurred for his people. Here's what he says, that is Plentyhead says to Frank Linderman, extremely important man, and again, I keep promoting it, but why not? I'm going to tell about Frank Linderman tonight at the Chateau. Anyway, so here's what Plentyhead says to Linderman. "I have not told you half that happened when I was young. I can think back and tell you much more of war and horse stealing. But when the buffalo went away, the hearts of my people fell to the ground, and they could not lift them up again. After this, nothing happened." He's saying after the bison are destroyed, after the reservation is imposed, nothing happened. "There was little singing anywhere. Besides, you know that part of my life as well as I do. You saw what happened to us when the buffalo went away." So, a despairing, a daunting, a sad statement. But guess what? Plentyhead didn't give up. For one thing, he did consult with Young Man Afraid of His Horses. We know this. So when Young Man Afraid of His Horses does come to the Crow Reservation, he consults with leaders like Plentyhead. Furthermore, Plentyhead had a great vision when he was a very young man. In fact, when he was 7 years old. And that vision guides him during the reservation years. So here's Plentyhead's vision. "The dream of Plentyhead means that the white men will take and hold this country, and that their spotted buffalo will cover the plains. He was told to think for himself, to listen, to learn to avoid disaster by the experience of others. He was advised to develop his body, but not to forget his mind." You probably know this. One of Plentyhead's great themes throughout his long life was We, the Crow people, must become educated in order not just to survive, but to flourish. The tribes who have fought the white man have all been beaten, wiped out. By listening as the chickadee listens, we may escape and keep our lands. The chickadee was its power animal, his spirit helper. And so Plenty Coups acts on that vision and turns out to be an extremely canny, thoughtful, responsive, adaptive leader. He is still controversial. Some people would consider him somewhat collaborationist, or he didn't resist the immigrants enough, etc. But I would say we have to be realistic about what was possible for him in his time and place. So let's shift gears now and look at some of the immigrants, and I bet you'll know this one. This, of course, is Granville Stewart. Granville, of course, he was the librarian here in Butte, right? I love that about Granville Stewart. He had an extraordinary life. If Plenty Coups had a long life, so too did Granville Stewart. One of the things we have to know about Granville, and sorry to report this, but his dream throughout his life was to get rich. To get rich. It didn't happen. And frankly, he was ticked off. He frequently, in his journals, and we have his journals have been published, and he frequently will pause and say, you know, some ne'er-do-well made a lot of money. Why can't I, a man of quality and intelligence, make a lot of money? I'm sorry to report this about Granville, but you want to see these characters in 3 dimensions, right? You want to see them with words and all. So anyway, so in 1864, Granville is running a store, right, in Virginia City. He and his brother actually plan an expedition over to the Bighorn River. Again, this is 64 now. They plan an expedition to the Bighorn River. They want to get there ahead of the crowd, as it were. They want to plat a town. They want to plat some ranches. They want to find some gold. It doesn't work out. His older brother, James, whom he adored, cannot actually complete that mission. So that's Granville in 1864. Fast forward to 1889. He is now living on the DHS ranch near Lewistown, right, in the Judith Basin. DHS were Davis, Hauser, and Stewart. And you probably know Davis, they have roots here in Butte. So they were key backers of the ranch. So what's happened is that Granville, always looking for that next great opportunity, jumps into the cattle industry in the early 1880s. And he's following up on this boom mentality. I want to share this with you. This is a quote from a famous book that came out in 1881 called, how do you like this? I love this title, The Beef Bonanza, or How to Get Rich on the Plains. So this is a key line, and I got to tell you, Granville was not alone in falling for this. So Montana has undoubtedly the best grazing lands in America. The Yellowstone, Bighorn, Tongue River, and Powder River regions contain the maximum of advantages to the cattle grower. Except on the upper Yellowstone, few herds are yet located in eastern Montana. But in the future, the O'Connors, Kings, Kennedys, Hinsons, and Chisholms of the West will be found in the Yellowstone, Bighorn, and Powder River countries of Montana. So imagine you're Granville. You've been looking for the big score. Gold mining didn't work out. Running a store didn't work out. You know, gathering timber didn't work out. So you jump into this. I'm sad to report that he was fired as superintendent of the DHS in 1887. He wasn't very good at it. The other sad thing as we turn to 1889 is his wife, Albany, who was a Shoshone woman who was fluent in both Shoshone and English. Albany had passed away the year before, and Granville falls in love with a much younger woman, a former school teacher named Belle Brown. And so in June of 1889, he's now turned his attentions to Belle. It's starting to actually fracture his family, which of course is a mixed race family, right? It's starting to fracture the family. But Granville goes forward, he marries Belle. He goes on to actually distinguish career as an ambassador, and then of course, as I say, he becomes the librarian here. But in 1889, there's very much a sense that his life from 1864 is long gone. It's evaporated. His brother James has passed away, Albany's gone, he is now remarried, and life is taking a very different direction for Mr. Montana. So. All right. Yeah, I love this. Do you like the title for this slide? I love this slide. Montana Mephistopheles. Who's Mephistopheles? Anybody know Mephistopheles, who that is? He's a demon from Dr. Faustus. Mephistopheles, by the way, his name, one possible meaning of it is basically spreading lies. Spreading lies. So you can imagine whoever called Wilbur Sanders, and this is Wilbur, whoever called Wilbur Sanders Mephistopheles, it wasn't a term of flattery, obviously, okay? They're saying in so many words he's a liar. He spreads lies. Also that he's a demon. So, Wilbur Sanders, 1864. He arrived in Bannock, Montana in September of 1863, led by none other than Henry Plummer. I know who Henry Plummer is. Henry Plummer was, we think, the head of that terrible road gang, right? Yeah. So he guides Wilbur Sanders and Sidney Edgerton into Bannock. Sidney Edgerton and Sanders, two diehard Republicans, by the way, they were radical Republicans. They really believed in it. They have Thanksgiving dinner with Henry Plummer in late 1863. We just came out of Thanksgiving. Seems like a good time to think about it. By January 10th of 1864, Henry Plummer is being dragged out of his cabin at Bannock and strung up. They actually go right by Wilbur Sanders' cabin. So Wilbur apparently, this is the story, it may not be true, but I want it to be true because it's such a good story. So I think it's true. So there's Wilbur Sanders standing on his cabin porch. I doubt they even had a porch. And here's Henry Plummer being dragged by a very large crowd of vigilantes. And he knows where he's going. He's going to his death. He's going to be strung up. And so Henry Plummer pleads with young Wilbur Sanders, diehard Republican, pleads with him and says, Wilbur, save me. And Wilbur says, Henry, you couldn't feel worse about this than I do, but there's nothing I can do to stop this. Which, I'm just going to say, I think we're all thinking it, it's a little insensitive at that point. I think that's a little insensitive. Now, the truth is, Wilbur was the primary prosecuting attorney behind the vigilante decision to string up Henry Plummer, okay? And there's a lot of debate about that. You guys have probably gotten into it. We can have a great long argument about was Plummer guilty, etc. But one possible reason is that Plummer was Democratic in his leanings. So there's some speculation that that's why this Montana Mephistopheles wanted to string up Plummer. Fast forward to 1889, okay? So Wilbur Sanders now has become a very prominent citizen in Montana. He often will actually represent folks like the Chinese in Butte. He will represent Native Americans in various court cases. So by our standards, we might almost think of him as liberal in that sense. But he's also a down and dirty, hard-fighting politician, right? And his biggest dream is to get into the U.S. Senate. Lo and behold, he will get into the Senate after statehood, but it's in the worst possible way. I'm going to tell it briefly. I'll read about this tonight, but very briefly what happens is when the state to be approves the Constitution and validates Montana will become a state, they're also going to vote on various representatives, right? And there were irregularities in Silver Bow County with the voting, and that leads to two different houses. So Montana becomes a state November 8, 1889, and right at the start there are two different houses, one Republican, one Democratic, because of voting irregularities in Silver Bow County. They end up, both of those houses end up nominating senators to the Congress, right? Because that's what the houses did in that time. And so on the Republican side, you have, on the Republican side, we have Wilbur Sanders and we have Tom Power. On the Democratic side, we have William Clarke and we have Martin McGinnis. Well, it's a Republican Senate, so they take Sanders and they take Tom Power. Now, they only get to serve for a couple of years, and frankly, it's not a very distinguished career, but Wilbur Sanders does get to serve, in fact, in the U.S. Senate. So. All right, have you guys heard of these guys, Clara and Bud McAdoe? They're two of my favorite characters. So this, for me, as a Montana kid, this was one of those discoveries. And so I'll tell their story in brief. It's a very cool story. It's kind of a sad story, too, but aren't they all, now that I think about it? So let's begin with Bud on the left. Bud is an early settler. He arrives in Montana in 1862, before it's Montana. He's a gold miner. He makes actually pretty good money as a miner. He figures out, along with one John Bozeman, anyway, along with John Bozeman, he figures out that it's better to mine the miners than actually do the work of mining. So Bud goes over, Perry goes over into the Bozeman-Gallatin Valley, and he actually helps build the very first grist mill in that valley. His partner is actually none other than Thomas Culver, who actually we think ended up murdering John Bozeman. Anyway, so that's another story. So, but here is Bud McAdoo. So he's established in the Gallatin Valley, but he's thinking exactly the way those Stewart brothers were thinking. He's thinking, if I can cross over Bozeman Pass, get over into the Yellowstone country, get there first, claim real estate, and start selling stuff to the Indians and the railroads coming up the Yellowstone, I can make a living. So he crosses over about 1877, and guess what? He gets there, Perry gets over into the Colson area, the Billings area, just as the Nez Perce are coming up through Canyon Creek, right? And Bud will record that he had second thoughts about moving over there when he saw the Nez Perce coming through the valley. So Bud establishes himself in what is now the Billings area. He actually backs a town called Colson for reasons we don't have to go into. Colson is eclipsed by Billings. Who then is Clara? She's my favorite character. I'm going to brag a little bit. I have to say, what I love about 1889, as much as anything, is a lot of very charismatic, very amusing, very impressive women. Clara is one of them. Clara lands in the Yellowstone Valley near Billings when her husband, who's a physician living in Michigan, when her husband determines that he has very bad lungs. We assume he had consumption or tuberculosis. And he decides to come to the dry air of Montana to heal up. So they move from Michigan to the Yellowstone Valley, and sadly, her husband, Mr. Tomlinson, passes away. And so Bud and Clara become partners. Literally, they become partners in life. They also become business partners. So what they do is they buy up a ton of real estate in the Billings area. And again, you have to realize the railroad, the Northern Pacific, comes through, right, in 82, 83. They're on the ground floor. They buy up all that land, right, because they're expecting settlement, folks to move in. But the other big break for them is, through his networks, if you will, Bud learns about the Spotted Horse Mine up in Maiden, near Lewistown in the Judith Mountains. Well, Bud has physical problems also. He has paralysis. So he cannot manage that mine. So guess what? Clara, this very clever businesswoman, takes over management of the Spotted Horse Mine, and it makes them a lot of money. It literally makes them millionaires, right? Here's the sad part, though. So far, so good. They're working together during the Constitutional Convention in order to promote women's suffrage. Very cool. So the Con is going on in Helena in July and August of 1889. They're together, they're promoting women's suffrage, everything seems good. But the truth is, this is essentially their last effort together. Clara's going to move back to Michigan, take all of that wealth and go back to Michigan. Why? Scandal. Turns out that Bud had an affair, and the mistress said he had promised to marry her. So they have a court proceeding in Miles City. 140 letters are produced in public. Wow. And here's this very distinguished, intelligent, independent woman. She says, I'm not putting up with that. So Clara takes her money and goes home. I'm sorry, that's kind of a sad story. So let's go to a happy story. Okay, we're good. So here's another couple, and I love telling their story in 1864 because it is a story that tells us a lot about how difficult it was to settle in Montana in those early years. I think one of the discoveries for me, when I look back on history, I think it's somewhat easy, almost comforting to sanitize what happened. What was life like for those early settlers? Well, this couple, James and Pamelia Fergus, show us that it was really tough settling in Montana in 1864. Briefly, James gets here first. He's actually trying to find the means, the capital, to support their town in Minnesota. They really think of themselves as Minnesota pioneers, and they're trying to develop a town called Little Falls, right? And so really what James is doing, he's just looking for a lot of money through mining in order to capitalize that town in Minnesota. Well, that's not happening. He decides Virginia City is a very livable place. He writes to Pamelia and says, Pamelia, bring the kids with you. So Pamelia and the 4 children take the Oregon Trail, and it's scary. We have accounts of that. She wrote a lot of letters. It's an amazing thing. And it was scary, but she lands in Virginia City in August of 1864. They haven't been together a lot for about 4 or 5 years because James has been out looking for the capital, right? So they come together, and you want to think this is a happy reunion, but it's not. So this is a letter that James writes to Pamelia. He actually hands it to her. This is a letter he hands to Pamelia after a certain event. So I'm just going to read it to you and tell me what set this whole thing off. Mrs. Fergus, I have not had an opportunity to give you my private opinion of the disgraceful scene that took place before Mr. Gilpatrick Thomas Dillon and your own family at dinner one day last week, in which you made use of such language as never fails to disgrace, or at the very least lower a female in the estimation of all respectable people. Profane language is allowable to men by common custom, but when used by a woman, it is generally allowed that she only has to add drinking, and then she is prepared to become a public woman. Now you know what a public woman is, right? Yeah. Prostitute, okay? That's what he's saying. So, something happened at this dinner. James complained. Pamelia is probably just at her wit's end, like, can we just settle down here? She swore in company. And so James writes this letter to her saying, we got to get our act together here. And you, madam, really need to behave better. So what did she do at dinner to cause this eruption, this break? What did she do to the food, do you think?
She had lumpy potatoes.
Had lumpy potatoes? That's a good guess. Not a bad guess. That's not it. She put too much salt on the food.
God!
Okay, doesn't that tell you something? Isn't that one of those little moments, those human moments, that tells you people are pretty high-strung, exhausted, when they have this incredible row, this explosion over too much salt on the food. Fast forward to 1889. It's a nice story. It's different from, in fact, it's the opposite of Bud and Clara's story. So they end up moving to Armel's Creek, which is, again, near Lewistown. It's actually near the DHS Ranch. They were good friends with the Stewarts, for example. And James and Pamelia actually find a very satisfying life there. And so here's a letter from James describing that life in the late 1880s. Our children being all married, but Andrew, he's seldom at home, and me an invalid. Interestingly, James suffers from all kinds of physical ailments as well. But you can imagine, right, the beating their bodies took and mining, etc. We were, that is, Pamelia and I were always together and thought far more of each other than we did when we were young. I think people of good sense generally do. Having lived so long together, they become so used to each other's ways, become more like each other, are more forgiving, and one becomes, as it were, a necessity to the other. I know it was so with us. So you go from that dire, horrible letter of 1864 to this. Now, full disclosure, Pamelia actually had passed away in 1887. So in 1889, James is living pretty much as alone. His son is certainly part of the ranching operation. And James remains this very fussy, very determined, very strong figure in Montana. So, 1864, 1889. And now, this is a tough story to tell, but I think most folks from Montana are probably familiar with it. So this is the story of how the Bitterroot Salish end up migrating up into the Jocko Valley, or what we typically call the Flathead Valley, right, in the shadow, if you will, of the Mission Mountains. So let me begin with the Victor. I love this photo of Victor from 1864. So in 1855, I know a lot of dates, but in 1855, Victor negotiates a treaty with Isaac Stevens. And that treaty involves a reservation, creating a reservation for the Pend Oreille, the Kootenai, and the Salish peoples. Victor does not want to move his people out of the Bitterroot Valley up into the Chaco Valley. The Bitterroot is their home. It has been their home for hundreds of years. This is where they find sustenance. This is where they find religious conviction and support, etc. So he negotiates in the 1855 treaty, we will not leave the Bitterroot Valley till the President of the United States completes a survey and ratifies or validates this is not our land. Fast forward to 1889. Charlo, his son, has been able to keep the Bitterroot Salish in place, but in November of 1889, he has to write this letter. It's a heartbreaker. Charlo says, I will go, that is, we will go from the Bitterroot to the Flathead, I and my children. My young men are becoming bad. They have no place to hunt. My women are hungry. For their sake, I will go. I do not want the land you promise. I do not believe in your promises. All I want is enough ground for my grave. We will go over there. And what's happened, of course, is you no doubt know, the Bitterroot's been claimed. I mean, think about Marcus Daly in the Bitterroot, right? He has that massive stock farm, for example. I believe it was 200,000 acres total. And so when he says there's no food, there is no, of course not. It's all been trapped out, it's been hunted out, and you have agriculture moving in, you have ranching moving in, and so Charlo was compelled to move in 1889. Now, we have other major statements from Charlo about his relationship with the men who come to negotiate with him. And so here's just another statement from Charlo. You may carry me to Fort Missoula dead, but you will never carry me there alive. I heard before that your great father had printed a book showing my name to the Treaty of 1872, but I never signed nor told anybody else to sign it for me. As to carrying me to the fort like a bag of grain, you did not talk that way when your people were going to California and came through my country sick and hungry. I had many warriors then and could have killed them all, but we nursed and fed them and did all we could to make them happy. I have no faith in what you say now, for the government has broken all the promises made by your great father in 1855. So, ironically, it is not for another 2 years until they actually make the move, for a whole lot of reasons we don't need to go into. But the day they move in 1891, here's what Mary Ann Combs, a very young Salish woman, says. Everyone was in tears, even the men, and the procession was similar to a funeral march. And now I want to introduce you to a remarkable woman, Helen Clarke. Helen Clarke is the daughter of Malcolm Clarke, who was a major fur trader, negotiator, and all about charismatic and very dramatic man. He was a great guy. And then his wife was Kokona, who was a Pagan or Blackfeet woman. She was actually the daughter of mountain chiefs, so she was a very, very important figure. And so they produced this amazing woman, Helen Clarke. Helen Clarke is extraordinary because she is born in Montana. They send her back to St. Paul in order to get an elite education. Helen gains that elite education. She comes back to Montana, and in 1869, she witnesses the terrible murder of her father. Her father, Malcolm, you may know, was killed by Owl Child, who was actually related to Kokona, the mother. And so it's a catastrophe for the family. Malcolm is dead. Kokona collapses psychologically, and Helen flees. She wants no part of this place. She actually becomes a famous actress, extraordinary. And one of my great regrets, a lot of you do research, one of my great regrets is many of the papers having to do with her life as an actress, those have been lost. They were destroyed in the fires. So we can't, we can't fully reconstruct. I would love to know what that was like. We have just glimpses of what that was like. Anyways, she returns to Montana after her acting career, and she becomes a school teacher initially in Fort Benton, then comes down to Helena, and guess who becomes her sponsor, her mentor, her father figure? It's Wilbur Sanders, Montana Mephistopheles, right?
Oh boy.
And so he welcomes her in. She becomes actually the superintendent of schools in Helena, which is extraordinary in the 1880s. But she decides in December of 1889 she has to leave. She says, I can't stay here anymore. I'm not welcome. I'll never be fit for Montana. A really interesting phrase she uses, she says we're living in the age of tribes, by which she means that people are going into their separate identities, their separate peoples, and so a mixed race person like her does not have a place. There's no place to reside, to be comfortable, to be fully confident, right? Anyway, here's a letter that was written by a mother in Helena about her, about Helen Clarke, and I think it gives some context, if you will, for Helen's decision to leave. I do not intend sending Grace and Robbie to school again this winter. I have long been dissatisfied with the school. Mr. Howie, the principal, is an excellent Christian man. Grace's teacher, Miss Clarke, is a half-breed Indian, the daughter of Malcolm Clarke, who, you perhaps remember, was killed by the Indians nearly 11 years ago. Miss C was educated in a convent and is avowedly a Catholic, but she has no faith in God or man. She hates the school, hates her work. While I am sorry for her, she is not the person I would choose as an instructor of my children. So that is the kind of prejudice she's facing, and it's very interesting what she chooses to do. She chooses to become an allotment agent. And I'm not going to go into depth on allotment because that's a complex story, but it's a way, essentially, of dispossessing Native people of their land. And that's what she chooses to do. So a very important figure, very interesting figure, leaves Montana in 1889. All right, you've been waiting. Here are the Butte characters. You want the Butte characters. That title is dramatic, but I think it's accurate. But we have many historians here, and you can help me. Copper Kings begin battle in 1889. You might say, whoa, what? No, hold it. How am I going to get away with that claim? Well, this is an amazing letter. So in January of 1889, Marcus Daly writes to Sam Hauser, right? They're both Democrats. He writes this. This is Marcus Daly now, right? Writing to Sam Hauser. To tell you the truth, I am so disappointed and so disgusted that I have now quit politics for good. That's what Daly said in January of 1889. We know that's totally wrong, right? I mean, we know it gets crazy. We got a capital thing coming up in a few years, right? Among other things. So the question becomes, why the heck would Daly write that in January of 1889? I'm done with politics. I'm disgusted. I can't do it anymore. Backtrack. William Clarke, you probably know, was a very early arrival in this area. He also got here around 1861, 1862. Super smart businessman. We know that, right? So he just, investment after investment, pans out, pays off. He buys into Butte. He's a major figure. He is very impatient with newcomers like Daly. Daly arrives in the 1870s. He's an Irish immigrant. He's Catholic. There are all these suspicious kind of auras around him. So they don't like each other. And in fact, there's a lot of history here before 1888, 1889. But let's go back to this moment, 1889. What was it that happened that's causing Daly to say, I'm done, I'm disgusted with politics? Well, it turns out Daly betrayed Clarke in the 1888 election for the last delegate, territorial delegate to Congress. He betrayed him. They're both Democrats. He should support him. Why does Daly betray Clarke? And when I say betray, what he does is he tells his people, his workers, don't vote for Clarke, vote for the Republican. This kind of nameless dude named Carter, right? Was no nameless person. The reason he does it is Daly is in cahoots, we believe, and I think it's pretty authoritative. Daly was in cahoots with A.B. Hammond from Missoula, and they are logging an awful lot of timber off reservation and public land. They are under threat of a suit. They're going to be sued, and it could cost them big time. They think a Republican in Congress would serve them better than a Democrat, especially one who doesn't like Daly very much. So that's it. It's a big betrayal. And here's what Clarke writes. I love these guys. I love the way they write. They just write so colorfully, right? So Clarke is writing here to Martin McGinnis. The conspiracy was a gigantic one, well planned and well carried out, even though it did involve the violation of some of the most sacred confidences. I love that. However, as you suggest, that is, you, Martin McGinnis, as you suggest, the day of retribution may come when treason may be considered odious. And the day of retribution does come, right? What's the capital of Montana now? It ain't Anaconda, Montana. It's Helena, Montana. And that was the bitterest loss of all. So this is just a glimpse into these two characters. They're actually quite prominent in 1889, as you might imagine. All right, you've been a great audience. So just a little more information. So I do have a website that has a whole lot of cool stuff on it. Montana is very simple to remember, montana1864.com. And if you go there, you'll find all kinds of links to sources, incredible sources online, plus a whole bunch of study questions. And if you have a book club, you can use the questions for that. And finally, I cannot conclude without crediting, right? So we're here in the archives. This is an extraordinary facility. And I have to thank the archive staff. Ellen Crane and the staff were very helpful as I did my research for 1889 and 1864. So I want to thank them. But Montana Historical Society has a great photo archive collection. So really leaned on that a lot. So without further ado, questions. I know I went a little while there. So questions.